My sister Cordelia was threading magazines in the base library when Colonel Brennick walked in, looked at her name tag, and went completely white. What he whispered next changed everything I thought I knew about the quiet girl who raised me. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. I'm Staff Sergeant Blake Hartwell, and for the past 28 years of my life, I believed I knew my sister better than anyone. Cordelia raised me after our parents died in a car crash when I was 16. She worked 3 jobs to put me through college, supported my decision to join the military, and even moved to Colorado when I got stationed at Fort Denison, just so we could have Sunday dinners together. She's the kind of person who apologizes to furniture when she bumps into it, who brings homemade cookies to work every Friday, and who has never raised her voice at anyone in my entire memory. For 2 years, she's been the base librarian at Fort Denison. Every soldier who walks through those doors knows Miss Cordelia. She remembers everyone's name, their favorite genres, and always has a gentle smile ready. She wears soft cardigans in pastel colors, keeps fresh flowers on her desk, and has turned what used to be a sterile military library into something that feels almost like home. The toughest soldiers in our unit have confided in her about missing their families, and she's helped dozens of guys write letters home to girlfriends and wives. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other. I was heading back from lunch, deciding to stop by the library to return a book I'd borrowed about motorcycle repair. The October sun was streaming through the tall windows, casting everything in that warm golden light that made the whole place feel peaceful. Cordelia was at her usual spot behind the main desk, methodically organizing the magazines that soldiers had returned over the weekend. Time magazine, Sports Illustrated, Popular Mechanics. She worked with her typical quiet efficiency, humming something soft under her breath. Her auburn hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and she wore a cream-colored cardigan that I'd given her for her birthday last year. I was about to call out to her when Colonel Brennick burst through the main doors. He's not a man who enters rooms quietly. At 53, he commands respect just by walking into a space. 25 years of military service have carved lines into his face and given him the kind of presence that makes junior officers straighten their spines automatically. He was clearly agitated about something, his jaw set tight and his eyes scanning the room like he was looking for a threat. He barely glanced at Cordelia as he approached the desk, probably seeing just another civilian employee. When he spoke, his voice carried that familiar military clip that brooked no delay. He needed access to some personnel files, something about a security review that couldn't wait until the administrative offices reopened after lunch. Cordelia looked up from her magazines, and in her typical gentle way, offered to help him locate whatever he needed. She knew the library's filing system better than anyone, and she'd helped officers track down documents before. But when she stood up and turned to face him fully, everything changed in an instant. Colonel Brennick's face went from military determination to absolute shock. The color drained from his features like someone had pulled a plug. His eyes locked onto Cordelia's name tag, and for a moment, he looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost walk through the wall. The air in the room suddenly felt thick and electric, charged with something I couldn't understand. Then he whispered one word that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my sister. One word that would reveal the woman who raised me had been living a lie for over a decade. One word that would change our relationship forever. To understand why that moment hit me like a freight train, you need to know our story. When I was 16, my parents were driving home from their anniversary dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Cordelia had just turned 21 and was finishing her senior year at Colorado State. She was studying international relations, had a full scholarship, and dreams of working for the State Department. She threw it all away to become my legal guardian. I remember the day she packed up her dorm room and moved back home. She never complained, never made me feel like a burden, but I could see the sacrifice in her eyes. While her friends were graduating and starting careers, Cordelia was learning how to be a parent overnight. She worked as a waitress at the local diner during the day, cleaned offices at night, and somehow still managed to help me with homework and make sure I didn't fall apart completely. She pushed me through high school, helped me apply for colleges, And when I decided the military was my path, she supported that too. The night before I shipped out to basic training, she sat on my bed and told me she was proud of the man I'd become. I cried like a baby, knowing I was leaving the person who'd given up everything for me. When I got stationed at Fort Denison 3 years ago, I figured that was it for our regular contact. Colorado to North Carolina isn't exactly a weekend drive. But 6 months later, Cordelia called and said she was moving to Clarksville, the little town just outside the base gates. She'd found a job as the civilian librarian at Fort Denison and wanted to rent a small apartment nearby. I was thrilled but also worried. At 32, she'd never been married, never seemed to date seriously, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still putting her life on hold for me. Her apartment was a tiny one-bedroom above a bakery, but she'd made it cozy with plants and books and the same gentle touches she'd brought to our childhood home. She kept a small garden in the back, growing tomatoes and herbs that she'd bring to our Sunday dinners. For 2 years, our routine has been perfect. Every Sunday at 5, she comes over to my place on base with ingredients for whatever she's planning to cook. We spend hours together, talking about everything and nothing. She tells me about the soldiers who come into the library, the books she's been reading, the progress of her garden. I tell her about training exercises, the guys in my unit, my plans for after my service ends. But there's always been something she doesn't talk about. Those 6 years between our parents' death and when she became my guardian, she never mentions them. I've always assumed she spent them working and struggling, doing whatever it took to survive and save money. I never pushed because, honestly, I didn't want to remind her of what had to be the hardest time of her life. Vixen. That's what Colonel Brennick whispered, and the single word hit the library like a bomb going off. I'd never heard the term used as anything other than an animal name. But the way he said it, with that mixture of recognition and disbelief, made it sound like something else entirely. Something important. Something dangerous. Cordelia's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The woman who jumps when someone drops a book went completely still. Not startled still, but predator still. Like a deer that's caught a scent and is deciding whether to run or fight. Her hands, which had been gently straightening magazines just seconds before, stopped moving entirely. Even her breathing seemed to pause. "I think you have me confused with someone else, Colonel," she said, and her voice was different. Not the soft, apologetic tone I'd heard my entire adult life, but something controlled and measured. Professional. Cold, even. Colonel Brennick stepped closer to the desk, his eyes never leaving her face. 13 confirmed kills. Sarajevo operation, winter of 2001. You disappeared after the inquiry. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, like he was reciting facts from a file he'd memorized. The words hit me like physical blows. Kills. My sister, who wouldn't harm a spider, who cried during sad movies, who brought injured birds to the veterinarian on her own dime. The concept was so alien that my brain literally couldn't process it. I stood frozen in the doorway, holding my motorcycle repair book like an idiot, while these two people talked about things that made no sense. Cordelia maintained perfect composure, but I know her tells better than anyone. The slight tightening around her eyes when she's stressed. The way her left hand moves almost imperceptibly toward her right wrist when she's nervous. The barely detectable tremor in her voice when she suggested that perhaps the colonel should speak with the head librarian instead, that there might be some confusion about personnel records. But Colonel Brennick wasn't buying it. He kept staring at her like he was looking at a ghost, like someone he'd known was dead had suddenly walked back into his life. "You saved my convoy that day, Lieutenant Brennick, 3rd Armored Division. You were positioned on the ridge, 800 meters out. Perfect shot, right through the windshield of that technical truck. The tension in the room was suffocating. Other soldiers were starting to notice something was wrong, conversations dying as people sensed the electricity in the air. I wanted to step forward, to defend my sister from whatever accusation this was, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way Cordelia stood, perfectly balanced, perfectly controlled. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't denied anything he'd said. Colonel Brennick left without another word, but the damage was done. The library felt different now, charged with secrets and questions I didn't know how to ask. Cordelia went back to organizing magazines like nothing had happened, but her movements were too precise, too controlled. When I approached the desk to return my book, she smiled at me with the same gentle expression she'd worn for years. But now I couldn't unsee what I'd witnessed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that word. Vixen, 13 confirmed kills. Sarajevo operation. The phrases rolled around in my head like broken glass. I kept trying to reconcile them with the woman who'd taught me to tie my shoes, who'd sat up with me when I had nightmares after our parents died, who'd never even owned a gun as far as I knew. By 3 a.m, I'd made my decision. I had security clearance for personnel databases through my communications position. It was a gray area, maybe crossing some lines, but I needed answers. If my sister was hiding something this massive, something that could put her in danger, I had to know. I started with the obvious search. Cordelia Hartwell, born 1991, Colorado. Nothing came up except her current employment record at Fort Denison. Clean background check. No military service, no criminal history. Exactly what I expected to find, which somehow made me more suspicious. Then I remembered the colonel's word. Vixen. Military units used call signs, code names for operations and personnel. I'd heard enough of them during my service to know they were usually animal-related, aggressive-sounding. I typed Vixen into the classified personnel search and held my breath. The file that came up was heavily redacted, mostly black bars across crucial information. But what I could see made my stomach drop. Active duty dates, 1998 to 2003. Deployment locations, Bosnia, Somalia, Iraq. Military occupation specialty, long-range reconnaissance, sniper operations. Status, discharged under classified circumstances, 2003. The timeline hit me like a punch to the gut. 1998 to 2003. Cordelia would have been 17 when this service record started, 25 when it ended. The exact years she'd never talked about. The years I'd assumed she'd spent struggling and working dead-end jobs to survive after our parents died. I printed everything I could access, my hands shaking as the pages emerged from the printer. Commendations for exceptional marksmanship. Citations for operations I'd never heard of in places that were barely mentioned in news reports. And buried in the final entry, a single line that made everything click into place. Subject voluntarily terminated active duty to assume family obligations. 2003. Sunday dinner arrived like a storm I'd been watching approach for days. Cordelia showed up at 5 sharp with her usual armload of groceries and that gentle smile that now seemed like the most elaborate disguise I'd ever seen. She talked about her week, about the new shipment of mystery novels that had come into the library, about Mrs. Patterson from the bakery who'd been asking about me. I listened and nodded and made the right responses while my printed pages burned like fire in my back pocket. Finally, as she was setting the table with her characteristic care, I pulled them out and placed them beside her plate. She saw them immediately. Her hand froze halfway to adjusting a fork, and for one heartbeat, the mask slipped completely. The woman standing in my kitchen wasn't my gentle sister anymore. She was someone harder, more dangerous, someone who'd learned to kill from impossible distances and disappear without a trace. Then she sat down, pulled the papers toward her, and began to read. Not frantically or defensively, but with the calm professionalism of someone reviewing a mission briefing. When she finished, she folded them neatly and looked at me with eyes that held decades of secrets. I was 17 when they recruited me, she said, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. Special Operations Command. They said I had a gift for long-range marksmanship and the kind of face that nobody suspected. Young, innocent, female. Perfect for getting close to targets who never saw death coming. The words hit me like bullets, each one destroying another piece of everything I thought I knew. My sister, the woman who apologized to inanimate objects, had been a trained killer before she was old enough to vote. I served in places that don't exist on official maps, she continued. Bosnia during the cleanup operations. Somalia when the warlords were carving up territories. Iraq during the early interventions that never made the news. They called me Vixen because I looked harmless right up until the moment I pulled the trigger. But Mom and Dad, I managed to say, my voice barely working. The call came while I was in Baghdad, she said, and now I could hear the pain she'd been hiding for 20 years. I had a choice. return to my unit and continue being one of the most effective snipers in military history, or come home and raise my 16-year-old brother who'd just lost everything. She reached across the table and took my hand. I chose you, Blake. I chose you over everything I'd ever been. The weeks that followed that dinner changed everything between us, but not in the way I expected. Instead of feeling betrayed or lied to, I found myself understanding my sister for the first time in my life. Her quiet strength, her ability to stay calm during emergencies, her fierce protectiveness, the way she could read people and situations with uncanny accuracy. It all made perfect sense now. I don't regret it, she told me one evening as we walked through her small garden behind the bakery. That life was about taking lives. This life has been about nurturing one. I'd rather be the sister who taught you to drive than the sniper who never missed her target. But the past wasn't quite finished with us yet. 3 days after our revelation dinner, Colonel Brennick returned to the library. This time he wasn't looking for files. He carried a small wooden box under his arm and walked directly to Cordelia's desk, where she was helping a young soldier find books about automotive repair. "Miss Hartwell," he said formally, waiting until the soldier had left, "I have something that belongs to you." Inside the box was a Distinguished Service Cross, the silver star gleaming against dark blue ribbon. "This was approved in 2002, he explained. "But because of the classified nature of your operations, it was never presented." I thought it was time that changed. Cordelia accepted the medal with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else. But later, when I visited her apartment, I found it tucked away in her desk drawer, not displayed prominently like most veterans would do. "Some recognition matters," she said when I asked her about it. "But the only approval I ever needed was yours." Knowing that the scared 16-year-old boy I raised became a good man. That night, sitting in my quarters, I realized that heroism isn't always about the battles you choose to fight. Sometimes it's about the battles you choose to walk away from. My sister's greatest act of courage wasn't any impossible shot she'd made in some distant war zone. It was hanging up her rifle to raise her brother. Every Sunday dinner we'd shared, every bedtime story she'd read when I was too old for them but needed comfort anyway, every driving lesson and college application and late-night conversation about my future. Those were her most important missions. And unlike her military service, these were operations she never kept classified. She'd been showing me her true heroism all along. I never missed a single one, she had said about those Sunday dinners, and now I understood that was the greatest victory of her life.